power is one of those words, just like policy, it's just as difficult to define. And so our discussion of definitions performs the same role as I provided for the previous question. So a classic way to start is to focus on what is called the community power debate. Who is powerful in this community? People would often ask in the sort of post-war US period, for example. And they would start with these sort of classic debates around what is often called elitism and pluralism. And people who were engaged in pluralism, they criticized this focus on identifying power with reference to reputations or the capacity to act. What they wanted to know was who actually exercised power to win key disputes. And to answer that question, you identify the most important problems, you find out who is involved, the power they exercise to contest the issue, and who wins and who loses. And the winners are the powerful people and the losers are the powerless. But that kind of approach has faced a sort of suite of different ways to criticize its focus. So people say it's not focused sufficiently on the following things. The first is the power to keep key disputes off the policy agenda. So often people will crowd the policy agenda with relatively safe or innocuous issues so that they can keep those big issues off the agenda. And no one can win disputes if you're not having those discussions. The second thing is the power to get what you want without appearing to exercise power directly. So sometimes that is when other people act in anticipation of what you will do as a result. So you don't actually exercise power, they just think that you will, and so they anticipate your actions. Another example is if people persuade or manipulate others into thinking that it's in their best interest to pursue the outcomes you favor. Again, you're not engaging in those key disputes, you're persuading people to act on your behalf. Then there are more sort of harder to detect manifestations of power in the behavior of other people. So for example, that can be group behavior to enforce social norms, or it can be individuals simply regulating their own behavior on the assumption that they're being watched or the assumption that they'll face punishment if they don't act in a particular way. So those things, the more you get into those examples, the harder they are to identify. So the second question in terms of the role of ideas. So people's ideas or beliefs is central to those discussions, and it's visible in those examples I gave. So for example, you can keep things off the policy agenda if enough people believe that the problem should not prompt government or state action. So for example, they don't believe the issue is important. For example, they believe it's important, but they think that the fault and responsibility lies with individuals rather than governments. For example, they believe it's important, but that no government can solve the problem or the solution would be too costly. So those are all examples of people's beliefs limiting policy debate. Or this is about people's beliefs when you manipulate people into believing that their interests are aligned with yours, or you manipulate people into acting on some beliefs rather than others. So I mean, I could give a couple of examples. One would be that kind of classic question, why do men dominate elected positions? Now, some of that is about the direct exercise of power to win disputes. But some of it is about social norms, about who should engage in public life and how you should treat women in public life in relation to how you treat men. So that's some is very visible power relationships, some is relatively visible. The second example is in relation to studies of colonial violence and this phrase epistemic violence. So you have the direct exercise of power to colonize countries, subjugate colonized populations. So that's the direct, very visible exercise of power. But then you have this less visible forms of power in which you privilege some forms of knowledge, like scientific knowledge, at the expense of other sources of knowledge, like stories of shared experience. And those are the kinds of examples where people's voices or their presence is being erased in everyday action rather than this overt violent action. So it all adds up to this idea that some of the most worrying forms of power are hidden in plain sight because they're the taken for granted norms and expectations that people reproduce in everyday life, and they can be just as important as these much more high-profile, exercises of power by other actors.